This is Audible.
Flesh Eaters by Joe McKinney. Narrated by Todd McLaren. Copyright 2011 by Joe McKinney. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Joe McKinney and Kensington Publishing Corporation, and was produced in the year 2011 by Tantor Media Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Life is the New Wealth. Max Brooks, Closure Limited. Chapter 1. Eleanor Norton's earliest memories were of hurricanes. As a little girl, she had seen Rita and Ike and Jacob rip Houston apart, their winds shearing off her neighbors' rooftops and sending them sailing away like kites. She remembered her family huddling like frightened animals in the hall closet, her mother trying to be brave, but still squeezing her so tightly she'd left bruises on Eleanor's skin. Then, in high school, she'd lived through Brendan and Lewis, storms that carried shrimp boats 10 miles inland and blanketed the city with ocean water that dappled like molten copper in the morning sun. She still carried memories of water moccasins gliding past the top of the swing set in her backyard, and pickup trucks floating like rafts down her street, and grown men on their rooftops crying without shame for all they had lost. She never outgrew that fear of storms. Even now, at 35, a mother of a beautiful 12-year-old girl, a wife to a wonderful man, a looming hurricane could still reduce her to jelly. The wind and the slashing rain and the overwhelming floodwaters touched some deep atavistic impulse inside her to run for shelter. Cataclysmic storms were a fear many Houstonians lived with, though most never talked about it. But now, as she stood in line at the Walmart, she could sense her own terror mirrored in the scurrying anxiousness of nearly everyone around her. Like her, they just wanted to buy their water and batteries and cans of Sterno and get home to their families before the storm made landfall. Waiting in line like this was maddening. Eleanor had been doing fine in the days leading up to Hurricane Hector. She was working in the Houston Police Department's Emergency Operations Command, attending all the briefings, and bringing home what she learned to her family, making sure they were ready. The ritual of getting prepared had helped to keep the fear at bay. But that morning, when she left for work, the sky had been a bloody red, and all the terror she'd felt as a child came back in a flood. She'd gone to work, and tried to work, she really did, but she was distracted and irritable. Captain Mark Shaw, her boss, had noticed. He noticed everything, and, in truth, it hadn't been hard to tell what was going on with her. She kept returning to the main window, the one that looked out over the green lawns of the University of Houston. Outside, the sky was changing from a horror movie red to a windy, sodden gray, and she couldn't take her eyes off it. Captain Shaw, who, despite his reputation, was not without mercy, sent her home. "You'll do more good with your family anyway," he told her. "We got this. Go on home." "Really? You're okay with me leaving?" she asked.
"It's no big deal. Everything that can be done has already been done. Nothing else to do here but ride it out. You can do that at home just as easily."
"I really appreciate this, Captain."
He dismissed her with a wave of his hand. "I'll see you in the morning," he said. "Worst comes to worst, and we get some bad flooding, I'll send a boat by for you." And so she'd gone to Walmart for a few last-minute things, her fear mounting as the wind picked up and the sky grew darker. When she finally made it through the checkout line and walked outside of the parking lot, the gray sky above her was limned with an eerie chemical green. The air was dense as a wet towel against her skin. She swallowed nervously, ducked her head against a gusting breeze, and rushed to her car. She hardly remembered the drive home. But once she was home, she and Jim and their daughter Madison still had so much to do to get ready. She could hear Jim with his power drill out on the front porch putting up plywood over the glass, and, looking out the little window above the kitchen sink, she mouthed a silent plea for him to hurry.
It was getting really scary out there. Part of Bay's Bayou ran through the green belt behind their house, and Hector's storm surge had caused its waters to rise significantly. Already there was an inch or so of brackish water covering their lawn, and a sharp, howling wind sent lines of lacy silver waves through it. They were surrounded by cottonwood and pines and giant oaks, and the same wind was tossing their branches back and forth, filling the air with leaves. Earlier that afternoon, Hurricane Hector had been upgraded from a Category 3 to a Category 5 storm, meaning that it would blow inland with winds over 155 miles per hour. And though she tried to suppress the thought, she kept having visions of a sustained blast of wind breaking off tree limbs and shooting them like arrows through the sides of their home. It had happened before, during Rita and Ike, when she was a little girl. She shook the memories of those storms from her mind and focused her attention out the window. From where she stood, she could just see a corner of Miss Hester's house across the street. The woman was 84, and struggling with what Eleanor suspected was incipient Alzheimer's disease. But she was a sweet old lady, and, with both Jim and Eleanor's parents dead, had even filled in as the grandmother that Madison had never known. There had been several years, right around the time Madison was starting school and Eleanor was still slaving away as a detective in the Houston Police Department's Sex Crimes Unit, and Jim was working at Gulfport Petrochemical, when they hadn't been able to afford childcare. They were working all the time, but still miserably broke. Miss Hester had come to their rescue. She took care of Madison during those years, cooked her dinners, taught her to paint, even picked her up from school on early release days, and in so doing had earned a special place in Eleanor's heart. In all their hearts, actually. And so it was with considerably more than neighborly concern that Eleanor watched the wind thrashing the pecan trees that surrounded Miss Hester's little one-story white house. Madison had spent the last 6 summers collecting pecans from those trees, she and Miss Hester shelling them and turning them into pecan pies and candied pralines. The trees were beautiful, even useful in their way, but they were notoriously ill-suited for bad weather. The wood was soft enough that the weight of the nuts alone could cause limbs to snap off in late summer. A strong Category 5 hurricane wind would blast the trees to bits. How long would it take, she wondered, before one of those bits lanced through the roof or a side wall, sending shards of glass through the house like birdshot from a 12-gauge. "Mom, you okay?" Eleanor half turned from the sink, but said nothing. Mom, hello." This time Eleanor turned around. The thick note of sarcasm in Madison's voice was something new, something she'd picked up, Eleanor suspected, from Susie Tyler and Brandy Moore, 2 girls who had just recently become Madison's closest friends. The 3 girls spent nearly every day that summer running around together, sleeping over at each other's houses, learning how to be teenagers together. It was natural behavior, Eleanor knew, but that didn't mean she had to like it. Susie especially seemed like a bad influence, always so loud and disrespectful to the other girls' parents. She had an annoying habit of making everything a competition between her and Madison, never missing a chance to gloat over some small victory, or rub in some awkward moment on Madison's part. And at 12, Madison was having plenty of those. Still, Eleanor backed off from actually telling Madison she couldn't hang out with Susie. Her own mother had been a shrew when it came to Eleanor's friends, and had taken an almost sadistic delight in pointing out how much she disliked the girls Eleanor ran around with. It had made her afraid to have friends over, and Eleanor promised herself she wouldn't be the same way, even if it meant swallowing the urge to fire a broadside here and there. "I think it's full, Mom," Madison said, nodding at the sink. Eleanor glanced behind her and saw that the 5-gallon plastic water jug she'd been filling at the sink was indeed running over. She turned off the tap, poured off a little, and then screwed down the cap. She lifted it from the sink with a grunt and put it on the floor next to the other 4 jugs she just filled. "That's the last of them, anyway," she said. Madison was sitting cross-legged on the linoleum floor, putting cans of soup into a cardboard box. But she paused long enough to study her mother. "Mom, are you okay?" "I'm fine, honey." "You sure? You kind of zoned out there for a second." Eleanor smiled, but didn't respond. There were times, certain moments when Madison had her head turned just the right way, when Eleanor could see how much her daughter really looked like Jim. It was in the profile, mainly. They had the same little upturn at the point of their nose, the same tapered chin, the same little tiny ears. Madison was the adolescent girl version of her father. But whereas those same features gave Jim an intelligent, studious aspect, especially when he wore his glasses, in Madison they became stunningly beautiful. "That girl is going to break 1,000,000 hearts one day," Eleanor thought, and it was an idea that both terrified and delighted her. "Why don't you take those upstairs, okay?" Eleanor said, nodding at the box of soup. "I can't lift it." "What? Sure you can." "No, Mom," she said, the sarcasm oozing back into her voice. "I can't. It weighs like a whole ton." "No, it doesn't. And don't say 'like.' You know I hate the way that sounds." Madison sighed and made a dramatic show of rolling her eyes. "Fine," Eleanor said. "We'll get your dad to do it. In the meantime, find something else you can carry. What's next on the family list?" Madison huffed indignantly, then picked up a yellow, coil-bound notebook that Eleanor had prepared to guide the family during a hurricane. She called it their family disaster plan. It contained nearly everything they would need to know about the contents of their supply kits and evacuation routes, plus contingency plans for getting the family back together again after the storm, should they get separated. Each member of the family also had a backpack that contained an individual 96-hour supply kit, a personal version of the yellow disaster plan notebook, family photos, important numbers, and a couple $100 in cash. The backpacks were already upstairs. What Eleanor and Madison were doing now was checking off the family supply kit for sheltering in place and carting the contents upstairs, just in case the floodwaters swamped the first floor of their house. Madison read from the list, pointing to items as she said their names. "Next up is sanitation. Toilet paper, soap, lady-time stuff." Madison's eyebrows raised slightly at her mother's euphemism for feminine hygiene products. "Disinfectant, bleach, garbage bags, and ties." "Why do you have those on here twice?" "What?" "Garbage bags and ties. You've got them here and in the miscellaneous section." "The sanitation section are for when you have to go to the bathroom. There should be a bucket with a tight-fitting lid there, too." Madison's lips parted slightly, her nose crinkling in disgust. "A bucket? Mom, that's gross." "No, that's survival, kiddo. You've never been through one of these storms. You don't know how bad it can get. I remember when I was a girl, the water was off for 2 weeks after Hurricane Ike. What do you think happens when the toilets stop flushing?" "Well, yeah, but—" Madison trailed off, her gaze shifting to the box of plastic trash bags, as if she was suddenly too grossed out to touch them. "You'll live," Eleanor said. "If it's all there, just take it upstairs." The smile disappeared from Eleanor's face as she watched her daughter cart yet another cardboard box of supplies upstairs. There were rough times ahead, and the girl was in for one hell of an education on the fury of nature. The thought sent Eleanor even deeper into her own head. She had talked with Jim an awful lot lately about how fast Madison was growing up. Her 13th birthday was only 2 months away, but the changes had already started. She and Madison had had the talk about the lady time, and it had been a lot harder, a lot more embarrassing than Eleanor had expected it to be. But in a way that talk had prepared her to think of her daughter as a woman, something that Jim was having a much harder time doing. Perhaps it was Madison's smile, that giggly little smile of hers that so perfectly recalled the way she looked as a toddler. Or perhaps it was just Jim's stubborn streak. Eleanor wasn't sure. But whatever the reason, he seemed determined to avoid the issue. He still called Madison his little girl, and in fact had started using the phrase more and more in recent months, which indicated to Eleanor that he knew the truth, at least on some level, but was unwilling to face it. She couldn't blame him, not really. There were times, plenty of times in fact, that she didn't want to face it either. Jim's electric drill had gone silent as he moved to a new window. The wind, too, quieted for a moment, and in that lull Eleanor heard the sound of arguing from across the street. She craned her head out the window, and what she saw there made her chest tighten with both pity and rage. Miss Hester was standing in the front yard, looking smaller and even frailer than she had earlier that day when Eleanor had passed her on her way into work. The wind was billowing her house dress out to one side, and her arms were crossed over her chest in a gesture that made her look completely helpless. Rain rings formed chain-mail patterns in the water at her feet. Standing at the edge of her lawn, next to a beat-to-hell red pickup, was her grandson, Bobby. When the guys at work mentioned meth heads, Bobby Hester was the image that flared up in Eleanor's mind. He was tall and lanky, so skinny his clothes fit him like a potato sack on a flagpole. He wore his filthy blonde hair down to his shoulders, and there were tattoos all up and down his arms, where the veins stood out like electrical cords beneath his skin. He was the one Eleanor had heard yelling, and as she watched, he opened the passenger door of his truck and put Miss Hester's TV inside. That manipulative, thieving little bastard, she thought. Though she couldn't hear what Miss Hester was saying, she could figure it out without any real difficulty. Miss Hester was scared. She wanted him to stay with her during the storm. She was probably begging him to stay. But Bobby Hester would never agree to something like that. He had miraculously reappeared in her life about 2 years ago, at the same time she started slipping a little from the Alzheimer's. To Eleanor it was no coincidence. He was a wolf sensing an easy meal, nothing more. Certainly not the long-lost grandson he had no doubt claimed to be. Eleanor had tried to say as much, but Miss Hester wouldn't listen to a word of it. She adamantly refused to see Bobby as bad news. She welcomed him into her home, and he repaid her kindness by robbing her blind. Now he was telling her to stop her whining, that he'd be back, that he just wanted to take her electronic stuff someplace safe. She wasn't holding back, was she? There wasn't a TV someplace she hadn't told him about. The fucking bastard is going to pawn everything she owns so he can get cash for his meth, Eleanor thought. And suddenly the image of her putting a bullet in his brain was very strong, and more than a little satisfying. A knock on the window made her jump. It was Jim, looking in on her, his knuckles still poised at the glass. She undid the latch and opened the window. "You're seeing this, right?" he said. "Yeah." Her pistol was upstairs in her backpack, and she couldn't help but wonder if she'd be able to hit Bobby from here. One good headshot would be all it'd take. "That man's a slimeball." "That's true," Jim said. "You want me to go over there and tell her to stay with us?" "I tried that this morning. She kept saying Bobby was going to stay with her tonight. That's all she would say. Bobby's coming. It'll be okay. Bobby's coming over." "Yeah, well, I don't think that's going to happen." "Don't you think I know that?" she snapped, and then instantly wanted to pull the words back. "Sorry." He nodded. "It makes me angry, too." "Yeah." He had a hand on the windowsill. He was filthy from putting up the plywood screens and cleaning up the stuff from the yard that might blow around during the storm and cause damage. But she didn't care. It was good to be home with him. She put her own hand on top of his and squeezed. He looked past her to the kitchen. "Where's Matty?" "Upstairs. We're going to need you to carry the food boxes." "Sure." In the distance, lightning flashed across the sky. A roll of thunder followed along close on its heels. The air smelled ominous, heavy with the scent of salt and sea. "You can smell it, can't you?" he said. "The storm's getting close." "Yeah." Across the street, Bobby's pickup fired up with a loud snarl, and he sped off, leaving Miss Hester standing in her front yard. Miss Hester watched him go, obviously frightened, then slowly turned and went back inside her house. "What do you want to do about that?" Jim asked. "She's family. We'll take her in. As soon as we're done loading all this stuff upstairs, I'll go over there and get her." "And if she won't come?" "You can't make her leave if she doesn't want to." "She's family, Jim. I won't let her ride this thing out alone." "Okay," he said. And with that they closed the window, and Jim dropped the last sheet of plywood into place over top of it. The first heavy band of rain came about 30 minutes later. It slammed into the side of the Nortons' house in enormous wind-driven blasts, beating against the roof and the exterior walls, roaring like a passing freight train. It lasted less than 2 minutes, and then slackened off to a steady, needling patter. They were in the game room upstairs. Madison's room was next door, but they had tacitly decided that the whole family would sleep here. Now father and daughter were rolling out sleeping bags, the two of them laughing over some stupid thing Jim had said. They seemed to be having a pretty good time of it, Eleanor noticed. She hadn't heard Madison laughing like this in a long while. Not even the wind and the rain outside seemed to bother her, at least not yet. She had her daddy with her, the two of them too absorbed in being goofy to be afraid of a little wind and rain. Jim was treating this like a big adventure, at least in front of Madison, and Eleanor was glad for that. It would help Madison to remain calm when things got really bad here in another few hours, and perhaps it would also help Jim to hold on to his little girl for a little while longer. A crisis like this, it would be terrible for the great, wide world outside their house. But here, inside, the Norton family was in a good place. Eleanor and Jim had met 14 years before, back when she was a brand-new patrol woman working every extra job she could find just to make the rent on a rat-trap apartment on Houston's Lower East Side. She was working security at a Flogging Molly concert the night he came into her life. He was with a group of his friends from his college days. He was cute, she thought. A little nerdy, maybe. Certainly more of a nerd than the cops she was used to hanging out with, but cute. He kept coming up to her, using really weak excuses to strike up a conversation. And as much as her cop training told her to disengage so she could watch the crowd as she was being paid to do, it was a very human part of her that liked the attention. During a break between songs, he worked up the nerve to ask for her number. "No way," she said. "Not while I'm working." "Not while you're working? What does that mean?" "It means I don't give out my number to strange men while I'm working." "I'm not strange." "You know what I mean," she said, smiling despite herself. "You can trust me," he said. "I'm a good guy. Come on, I don't bite." Her gaze shifted from the crowd back to him. He was leaning against a wall next to a dartboard, trying to look cool, but only managing a barely contained nervousness. He was cute, though. She couldn't deny that. "I'll tell you what. How about you give me your number, and I'll think about it?" His smile grew even wider. He hurriedly scribbled down his number on the back of his business card and handed it to her. "I usually get off around 6, he said. "I'll think about it," she answered. And she had thought about it. For 2 days she thought about it. She hadn't realized it going into the job, but dating options for a female cop are few. She could date other cops, and a lot of girls did, but there wasn't a sewing circle anywhere that could gossip like a bunch of cops. And the girls who did date their fellow officers quickly developed reputations as sluts, or bitches, or psychos, or whatever, whether it was deserved or not. The other option, dating a guy from outside the department, a civilian, was harder than it sounded. Most of the men she met came into her sphere because they were in the process of committing some kind of crime. And even if they weren't doing something illegal, finding time to go out with them around the demands of a rotating police schedule was nearly impossible. Plus, and this wasn't obvious, but it was something that nearly every female officer she knew had experienced, most men who weren't cops were intimidated by a girl who walked around with a gun in her purse, and who knew how to use it. But Jim Norton wasn't that way. He didn't seem intimidated by her at all. He'd made her feel special from the first moment he'd tried his dorky lines on her. And in the end, she'd called and asked him out. They were married 8 months later. Memories of those early days together always made her smile. But unfortunately, her reverie didn't last long. For just then, the shutters started to rattle. Another blast of rain and wind swept over the house, carrying with it a train wreck sound and the horrible feeling that God's shadow was passing overhead. "I need to go get her," Eleanor said. Jim, who had rocked back on his haunches, a corner of Madison's sleeping bag still in his hand, nodded. "Wait for this one to pass first," he said. "Mom." Eleanor looked at her daughter. The smile and the giggle were gone. For the first time there was fear in the girl's eyes. The knowledge that something big and angry had them in its sights was finally starting to sink in. Eleanor crossed the room and put her arms around her. "I'm going to bring Miss Hester here with us," Eleanor said. "Mom, you can't go out in that." "Sweetie, we can't leave her to face that alone. It'll stop in a second. I won't be gone long." "Promise?" Eleanor pulled her daughter close. "I promise." 5 days earlier, a Category 3 hurricane named Gabriella had zeroed in on Matagorda Bay, just south down the coast from Houston. Houston was expected to get the dirty side of the storm, and all the newscasters prophesied a Katrina-like disaster. A massive evacuation was ordered. Nearly 4 million people fled the Houston area, turning the highways that led to San Antonio and Dallas into parking lots. For 2 days, the city of Houston turned into a ghost town. But Gabriella didn't cooperate. She fizzled to a weak tropical storm while still at sea, and when she made landfall, all she'd been able to muster was a good soaking for the grass and a couple of broken windows along the coastline. Houstonians returned home, resentful of the ordered evacuation. It was why so many had ignored the current order to evacuate, now that Hector was on the way. In the back of her mind, Eleanor had hoped that Hector would blow itself out the same way Gabriella did. But when she stepped out her front door, all hope of that disappeared from her mind. Even the biggest trees were tossing wildly back and forth. Trash and leaves filled the air. Ocean-scented rain moved across the lawn in silvery, wind-blown curtains. A rainbow-colored canopy from a child's backyard swing set tumbled down her sidewalk. On the other side of the street, the pecan trees that surrounded Miss Hester's house were slamming against her kitchen wall, stray limbs raking across the roof, kicking up shingles and sending them airborne on the wind like playing cards. "You stay here," Jim said. "I'll go get her." "No," Eleanor said, barely aware that she was using the harsh, clipped tone of her cop's voice. "Let me. You stay with Madison." He looked indecisive, as though he was torn between his male instincts to take the risk and his knowledge that she was the one trained for this kind of thing. "I'll be okay," she assured him, but without softening her tone. It was best not to give him a chance to finish the debate, so that he wouldn't talk himself into doing something stupid. There was no time for that. "You stay with Madison. Keep her calm." And with that, she ducked her head and stepped off the porch and into the wind. The rain needled at her skin. Standing upright was harder than she expected. She had to tense the muscles in her thighs just to keep her balance. The ground was spongy beneath her feet. An inch of water stood on the ground, and everywhere she looked she saw the crawfish that had washed up from Bay's bayou, scurrying through the grass. To the south was a bank of black clouds that stretched across the horizon like an angry, roiling cliff. Charleston Street stretched a good half-mile out in front of her, before curving out of sight. Beyond the curve was the flat, greenish-black surface of Bay's bayou, now flooding the areas adjacent to its banks. And beyond the water was an industrial park of concrete and glass buildings. From where she stood, she could just see a line of those buildings disappearing beneath the bottom of the storm wall. To Eleanor, it looked like they were being eaten. She was too stunned to move. She stood there, mouth open in awe, watching the approaching monster. A loud crack to her right snapped her out of the moment, and she turned just in time to see a large limb from one of Miss Hester's pecan trees come crashing down on the corner of the house. It twisted in the wind, sagged, then scraped down the side of the house, ripping the plywood covers Jim had put over her windows from their brackets. The glass behind the plywood exploded with a series of muffled pops. But the tree didn't stop moving. Its dense cluster of leaves caught the wind like a sail and pulled it down the length of the house, tearing down a section of the wall as it tumbled away from the approaching storm. "Oh, my God!" she said. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. In a crazy, terrible, unreal way, it looked like the house was being zippered open by an old-style can-opener. The pecan tree shredding the wooden siding with unbelievable speed. "No!" she shouted. The tree tore free of the house and sailed down the street as though it were being dragged behind an invisible truck. Eleanor watched it go, then ran to the house. She pounded on the front door, kicked it with everything she had, even threw her shoulder into it. "Miss Hester! Betty Jo! Open the door! It's me, Eleanor!" Nothing. She threw her shoulder at it one more time, then ran for a damaged section of the wall, shielding her face from the wind with her arm as she searched for a way inside. The gash left by the pecan tree had torn the kitchen wall in half. Shredded electrical wires extruded from the lath, their jagged ends reaching for her like dangerous fingers. The wind was roaring in her ears. The air around her smelled of musty insulation and ocean rain and crushed vegetation. "Miss Hester!" she called out. "Can you hear me?" Nothing. She was really scared now. Her face hurt from the pelting rain. "You got to get inside right now," she thought. "There's no time. Go, go, go!" Eleanor climbed over the jagged fragment of kitchen wall. Inside, the house was a mess. Water was already pooling on the living-room floor and dripping down the walls. Debris was strewn everywhere. A large recliner was upside down against the back wall of the living room, papers and pictures swirling around it. Eleanor ran for the hall closet. Back in May, when all the literature about hurricanes had first started appearing in the papers, Eleanor had told Miss Hester to take shelter there if she was trapped at her house during a hurricane. She threw open the door, but the closet was empty. A sudden surge in the wind threw her against the wall, yanking the doorknob out of her hand. "Miss Hester!" Her only answer was the wind ripping into the house, tearing the walls apart. From somewhere behind her she heard a loud snap, followed by the sound of walls breaking apart. "No," she thought, shaking her head. "That is not possible." But it was happening. The house was buckling, the timber inside the walls snapping like bones as the floor shuddered beneath her feet. "Where are you, Betty Jo? Come on, damn it!" And then a memory surfaced in her mind. In the academy, they taught young police officers how to handle calls for missing toddlers. Abducted children, her instructors had told her, are rare outside of the movies. You get a call for a missing 4-year-old, the first place you look is under the beds. The parents will tell you they've looked everywhere, but they're too scared to focus on the obvious. Chances are you'll find the kid there, under the parents' bed, playing, hiding, maybe even sleeping. A small table along the hall wall began to sway and dance. All the pictures along the wall fell to the floor. A few blankets floated on the air, buoyed by the wind. Everything happened so fast, all she could do was stand still and gawk at the destruction. Then the floor shifted beneath her, and she ran for the back bedroom. The wind had blown debris into the doorway, but most of the room looked the same as it always did, neat and tidy. A flash of lightning filled the room, spilling light across the quilt at the foot of the bed. Eleanor got down on her hands and knees, lifted the bedskirt, and saw Miss Hester curled into a fetal ball. She was trembling. "Betty Jo, take my hand! I'm going to get you out of here!" No response. The woman was in shock. Her eyes were open, glittering like coins caught by firelight, but they were unfocused and vague. Eleanor could hardly believe that the woman had made herself so small. "Betty Jo, please! Take my hand! I have to get you out of here!" Eleanor tried to reach for her, but Miss Hester had wedged herself deep under the bed, just out of reach. "Please," Eleanor said. "There's no time." Not gonna happen, Eleanor thought. She stood up, grabbed the wooden bed frame, and tried to lift it. If she couldn't pull Betty Jo out, she'd throw the bed off her and scoop her up fireman style. But it was a huge wooden sleigh bed, impossibly heavy. She strained against its weight with everything she had, but only managed to raise it a few inches off the floor. Her fingers were slipping, the muscles in her arms and back and neck screaming at her to drop the weight. "Come on," she said. "Please." "Eleanor, where are you?" It was Jim's voice, coming from somewhere in the living room. "In here," she answered. "Help me." The next moment he was by her side, his hands next to hers under the bed frame. She heard him grunting, felt his body tense next to hers, and the next instant the bed was rising, coming up above her head. "Get her out of there," Jim said. "I'll hold it." Eleanor dropped to her knees again and scrambled under the bed. Miss Hester's body was curled so tightly into a ball, Eleanor had trouble moving her. "Hurry," Jim said. "Betty Jo, come on," Eleanor said. She slid an arm under the woman's trembling body and pulled her out from under the bed. "Clear!" she yelled to Jim. He let the bed fall, then reached down and scooped Miss Hester up from the floor. "Find us a way out," he said. "I'll carry her." The wind had blown a pile of crushed furniture and tree limbs and trash into the living room, and Eleanor had to climb over it to reach the front door. She kicked it once, twice, and it burst open as the wind caught it and ripped it from its hinges. In disbelief, Eleanor watched it slide across the yard and down the street. But there was no time to wait. The roaring wind in the doorway created enough suction to pull her out, and she had to grab hold of the frame just to keep from getting carried away like the door. Beyond the doorway, the sky had grown impenetrably dark. Rain was slashing sideways across her field of vision. She steadied herself against the wind, then reached in and took Miss Hester from Jim. "You got her?" he asked, yelling to be heard over the wind. "Yeah, come on." He scrambled out of the doorway after her, and together the two of them carried Betty Jo Hester across the street and into their house. Madison was waiting for them. She threw a towel over Miss Hester and helped Eleanor clean her up. Miss Hester started to come around after they had her dry and wrapped in blankets. She looked at Madison and tried to smile, but couldn't. Her gaze shifted to Eleanor, and the sadness in her eyes nearly took Eleanor's breath away. "He didn't come back," she said. "Bobby didn't come back." He said he'd be right back for me. Why didn't he come back?" Eleanor didn't know how to answer her. She leaned forward and kissed the old woman on the forehead. Only then did she realize how much she ached, how every muscle in her body was trembling. She looked around the room, taking in the sight of her family around her, and then she let out a heavy sigh. They spent the next 13 hours huddled in their game room like scared animals, as the hand of God passed overhead. The next morning they stepped out onto their front porch and gazed at the destruction. Where before there had been a suburban neighborhood of well-paved roads and wide green lawns, there was now only water. Every house was an island, every one of them missing shingles from the roofs. Eleanor stepped to the edge of her porch and looked down. She could barely see the grass down there, beneath a foot of brown water. Out in the street it was deeper. She could see the roofs of cars poking up above the level of the water, which was flowing sluggishly to the south. She watched a large mattress float down the street. It hit the roof of a pickup and turned a slow pirouette before continuing on its way. Somewhere off in the distance a dog was howling. It was a lonely, frightened sound that sent a shiver across Eleanor's skin. She and Jim had debated about getting Madison a cat or a dog for the last several months, Eleanor saying no, absolutely not, and Jim, wishy-washy as he always was when it came to saying no to their daughter, willing to give in to just about anything Madison wanted. She had hated being the bad guy when Madison asked, pleaded with them for a pet. But now, listening to that terrified animal's howls, she was glad she'd stuck to her guns. "Oh, wow!" Eleanor looked back at Madison. The girl was wide-eyed, looking at all the water. "It's something, isn't it, kiddo?" "Yeah." "Oh, my God, Miss Hester, look at your house!" Madison pointed across the street. A large pecan tree limb was jutting out of the house, the gash in the kitchen wall packed with green leaves and garbage. "Did that happen while you guys were over there?" "No," Eleanor said. "After." She chanced a quick glance at Miss Hester, who was staring at her house with an empty, shocked expression on her face. Eleanor put a hand on her daughter's shoulder and made a silent gesture for her not to say anything more about it. To her credit, Madison picked up on the signals immediately, and the fascinated smile slipped from her face. Good girl, Eleanor thought. A motorboat came into view. The pilot eased back on the throttle and let it coast up to the curb in front of the Nortons' house. "Sergeant Norton," he said. "Good morning, ma'am." "Good morning, Hank," Eleanor said. The pilot's name was Hank Gleason. He was a member of SWAT Team 3, on loan to the EOC for as long as the city of Houston was in Phase 3 of the disaster mobilization plan. Gleason was wearing green SWAT fatigues with a day-glow green safety vest over top of his shirt. On his head was a floppy, boony cap, pushed far back, away from his sunglasses. "How y'all doing?" he called out. "Everybody all right?" Eleanor couldn't help but smile. He had that effect on most women. "We're doing fine, Hank. You come to pick me up?" "Yes, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat to Miss Hester and Madison. "Captain Shaw says if it ain't too much trouble he'd like you to come back to work." Jim caught the bow of the bass boat and guided it up alongside the porch. "Thank you, sir," Hank said. He and Jim shook hands. "How is it out there, Hank? It got pretty rough here last night." For the first time that Eleanor could remember, the smile disappeared from Hank's face. His shoulders sagged, and, in that moment, the unflappable SWAT veneer dropped away, and he looked utterly exhausted. And then, just as quickly, the smile was back again. "Ma'am, I don't envy you folks over at the campus. You're going to have your hands full." "Why? What happened?" "All the evacuees from Galveston, Texas City, Dickinson, those places," Hank said.
A lot of 'em was stranded on the freeway by the floodwaters. Captain Shaw decided to open the campus to as many people as it could hold. People have been coming in by the thousands since before sunup. The place looks like its own little city now."
Eleanor didn't know what to say. Captain Shaw was the incident commander for the entire region for the duration of the crisis, but he didn't have the authority to throw open the doors of a university to a bunch of stranded motorists. Something like that would take an act of Congress or an order from the governor or something. What Hank was suggesting was crazy. It was career suicide on Shaw's part.
So what? He just opened up all the dorms and let anybody who needed a place to stay come on in?
"Yes, ma'am. That's about the size of it. The school's got restaurants, a hospital, its own power station. Captain Shaw opened it all up to the public."
"I can't believe that," she said. That's nuts."
"It's no joke, ma'am. I ain't never seen anything like it. Most of the folks they're taking in are the ones who aren't strong enough to continue on their own. Old people, families with young kids, sick people, you know. But they got folks everywhere, wandering around like they've just been dropped on the moon. Nobody knows what the hell's going on."
Eleanor nodded, but she was still trying to imagine the scope of the gamble Captain Shaw was making.
"I can't believe this, Hank. Did the campus agree to let Shaw do this?"
"Ma'am, I don't know. Captain Shaw told me to come and get you, and here I am. All I can tell you is it's going to be a mess when you get there."
"Yeah, sounds like it. Well, I guess we should get going."
"Yes, ma'am, I think so."
Eleanor turned and kissed Jim and Madison, and climbed onto the bass boat. It would be 3 more days before she made it back home. Chapter 2. Captain Mark Shaw, head of the Houston Police Department's Emergency Operations Command, had slept in his uniform again. He'd been doing that a lot lately. Groaning, he sat up on the side of the bed and tried to stretch, but a sharp pain in his back made him flinch abruptly. He closed his eyes and waited for the pain to subside. Instead, an acid burn climbed up his throat.
"Looks like it's going to be aspirin and Rolaids for breakfast again,"
he thought bitterly. He'd been doing that an awful lot lately, too. How in the hell had he let himself get to this point? He was only 58, for Christ's sake. It hadn't been that long ago when he could do a week's worth of 24-hour shifts standing on his head. But these days, there were too many headaches, too many backaches. Heartburn was getting to be a daily companion. And he knew why, too. That part wasn't a mystery. It was the job. A police career wears down every cop who takes the oath. Good man or crooked, a hard worker or a slug, it just doesn't matter. Sooner or later, the job eats you up and shits you out its backside. The thing was, and it hurt more than a little to finally admit to himself that it was true, Shaw honestly thought it would never happen to him. Lesser men, sure, but he had somehow sold himself on the idea that he was made of iron.
"Good God," he thought, "were you ever wrong?"
Rubbing the sleep from his eyes, he looked over at the clock. 8:15. That meant he'd been asleep for just under 2 hours. Since Hurricane Hector 7 days earlier, he'd been working non-stop, managing only a cat nap here and there had been very few of those. Now, his exhaustion ran bone deep. With a heavy sigh, he rose from the Red Cross cot he'd moved into this little storage closet off the main floor of the EOC's temporary headquarters, pulled on his gun belt, straightened his uniform, and walked onto the main floor. Sergeant Eleanor Norton, his XO, was standing with a few other members of his staff, going over a map of the Houston ship channel. They made eye contact. Then she excused herself from the huddle of officers and walked over to him.
"Anything new?"
he asked.
"Yes, sir, a bunch. What do you want first, the bad news or the really bad news?"
He smiled tiredly.
Break me in easy. Okay. I got another call from the ATF just a little while ago. They're starting to get really uptight about the Santa Fe.
Shaw nodded. He'd seen that one coming. 7 days earlier, Hurricane Hector had sent a 16-foot storm surge up the mouth of the Houston Ship Channel. That wave had wrecked countless offshore oil rigs and cargo freighters and homes, and stripped massive amounts of trees from the landscape. It had also created a public safety nightmare. Every evacuation route out of the area was blocked. So, too, were most of the ways into the area. That left 2.5 million people homeless, screaming for help, with no power, no sanitation, no way out, and no way for rescue workers to get in. Then, 2 days ago, while they were still trying to recover from Hector, they got hit by Kyle. Kyle made Hector look like a rainy day in the park. That storm had sent a 34-foot storm surge right up the same course, almost as if it were on a set of rails. And this time, the waters came in to stay. Though Kyle was only 2 days in the past, the experts were already saying that the 1-2 punch of back-to-back storms had changed the shape of the Texas coastline forever, with most of the land between Galveston and southwest Houston now permanently underwater. And the storm surge had done something else, too, something the experts had never predicted. It had created a secondary wave that kicked up all the debris and floating chemicals and topsoil and dead animals and houses and sewage and leaking oil from the offshore drills, and turned it all into a wall of liquid mud that pushed inland as far as the 610 Loop, nearly 45 miles. Everything that wall of mud touched was now buried in the muck and irredeemably polluted. And that included a Venezuelan cargo freighter called the Santa Fe. According to the manifest her crew had forwarded to authorities at the Houston Ship Channel, she was loaded with some 1,200 tons of ammonia gelatin dynamite, an underwater explosive used primarily by the oil companies to dismantle offshore drill rigs. She was currently beached on a vast, muddy plain near the suburban community of Deer Park, completely unsecured. An ATF special agent named Vernon Laidlaw had been crawling up Shaw's ass for the last 2 days trying to get the cargo secured. "Did you tell him it's on our to-do list?" Shaw asked Eleanor.
"Yes, sir, I told him."
"And what did he say?"
"Same thing as last time. He reminded us of the Homeland Security guidelines concerning unexploded ordnance. I've heard it enough I can quote the whole regulation chapter and verse if you want to hear it."
"No, thanks."
"Captain," Eleanor said, "I don't think he's going to quit calling. He sounded pretty pissed off."
"Yeah, well, maybe he ought to come down here and lend us a fucking hand if he wants it done so bad."
"Actually, he did offer that."
Uh-oh, Shaw thought. "He did?"
"Yes, sir. He said he could send an FBI SWAT team down here to handle the demolition in situ if we couldn't do it."
Shaw barely heard her. "In situ?" he muttered.
"Yes, sir. It means where it sits."
He looked at her. "I know what it means, Eleanor. Were those his words or something you came up with on your own?"
"That was him, sir."
"Thank God. I don't want any of my people to start talking like that." He shook his head. "Fucking feds. Give a cop a grad school education and you turn him into a dickhead without the common sense God gave to the ass end of a goat."
Shaw watched his staff working over the ship channel map and figured he couldn't wait any longer on the Santa Fe situation. He hadn't wanted to act on this now. They had a list of other problems so long they'd probably never get through them all. Plus, they had another hurricane, Mardel this time, forming out in the Atlantic. And, considering the way things had been going, he was willing to bet Mardel would be coming their way too. No, he couldn't wait much longer. "Okay," he said. "This is what I want you to do. Call Laidlaw back and tell him we'll use our own people on the Santa Fe.
Last thing I want is the Federal Bureau of Ineptitude rooting around my backyard.
Captain?
What?
Sir, with all due respect, I don't see how we're going to be able to do that. We're buried under projects right now.
We'll find a way to make it work.
But, sir, I mean, if they're offering help, shouldn't we—
I said no,
he snapped. She drew back, her eyebrows going up in surprise. Out of the corner of his eye, Shaw could see some of the officers on his staff watching them. "Look," he said, lowering his voice, "if the feds want to help, let 'em keep their sorry asses north of the city handing out sandwiches or something. The last thing I want is a bunch of SEAL Team wannabes blowing up cargo freighters while I'm trying to rescue civilians. Tell Laidlaw to keep his people out of my way. Understand?"
"Yes, sir,"
she said. Her tone was withdrawn, chastened, and he was sorry he'd snapped at her. She didn't deserve that. It was just that he was so damn tired. Really, really tired. "Anything else?" he said. "We had 3 more deaths this afternoon in the shelter over at the rec center." "Damn," he said. "How many is that now? 18?
"Yes, sir."
"What were these last 3? The salmonella?"
"That's what Dr. Bailey thinks. He told me all about it, and then he went on a very long tirade about how bad conditions were down there. He reminded me, several times in fact, that you promised him something would be done about the porta-potties." He scanned the room, watching his staff at their stations. Hector had done so much damage to southwest Houston, they'd been forced to appropriate the campus as a forward dispatch point for relief efforts. They now occupied a large meeting room in the M.D. Anderson Library, the library's cozy armchairs and lamp fixtures hastily tossed aside to make room for laptops and maps and phones. Originally, the university had given permission for Shaw and his staff to move in here for the duration of the disaster. But that was before Hector caught the 2.5 million people in the evacuation zones of Galveston and Harris County flat-footed. Within hours of the storm, Shaw found himself the only functioning police authority in the affected area. He had an empty campus, built to house 30,000 students, equipped with its own hospital and sewage plant and dormitories and restaurants, and even a grocery store, that was situated right next to the only major highway leading out of the disaster zone. He had tens of thousands of injured, sick, and starving people stuck on that same highway. And so, acting far beyond his authority to do so, Shaw made the only decision his conscience would allow, and opened the entire campus and all its facilities as a shelter for any of the evacuees who could get there. Within a day they had swollen the campus to a population of more than 80,000. But what began as a decision made for mercy's sake quickly became a nightmare of filth and disease. They had, within a few days, run out of medicines and food and clean water, and especially places for people to go to the bathroom. Staph and strep had already made an appearance. So too had salmonella. They had dialysis patients they couldn't care for, broken bones they couldn't set, cuts they couldn't keep clean. There was even ominous talk from the few doctors they had of an imminent cholera outbreak. "I'll call Bailey back later," he said. "Maybe smooth a few ruffled feathers." "Good luck,"
Eleanor said. Shaw nodded. Sheltering all these people here had been a bad idea. He could see that now. Never mind that it had been done for all the right reasons. Never mind that he would have been crucified in the national media and probably in the history books had he failed to do so. All that really mattered was that someone was going to have to answer for the mess it had become, and that person was going to be him. "Thank you, Eleanor," he said. "Hey, by the way, how's your family? Your daughter? Margaret, right?" She brightened.
"Madison. She's doing good. I'm proud of her. We've got this older neighbor whose house got hit by a tree during Hector. She's staying with us, but she's not doing so hot. Madison's been really strong, though.
Helping out, taking care of her. I almost hate to say it, but I think this experience has been good for her.
Well, times like these make us grow up fast.
Yes, sir, they do indeed. He excused himself and went over to his desk. In days gone by, he had always kept a clean, orderly desk. Once a Marine, always a Marine. But like the city outside his command post, his desk was now a wreck. He had to push reports and maps aside just to find his BlackBerry. And because he hadn't had enough misery today, he checked the missed calls screen and saw the number had climbed to 324. Fucking wonderful, he thought. He dialed his youngest son's number, and Anthony Shaw answered on the second ring. "Hey, Dad, what's up?"
"I'm up to my ass in headaches. Where are you?"
"We're bringing the boat in now. It was rough out there tonight. There's a lot of bodies floating around. A lot of people in shock."
"Never mind that. I need to talk to you. How soon can you be here?"
"What, you mean at the EOC?"
"I don't know.
We got a lot of gear to offload. And these survivors we found, we need to get them to the infirmary. I guess I can be there in about an hour, maybe?"
"That's not going to work. I want to talk to you now. Let Brent and Jesse take care of the boat and the survivors. Get here in 10 minutes.
He paused for a moment, then added, "It's about the Santa Fe." Anthony was silent for a long time. Shaw could almost see his son's lips pinch together, his brow crease. The boy was the very picture of his mother when he concentrated on something.
10 minutes, Anthony said. "We finally going to move on that?"
"Just get here, okay? I'll talk to you about it in person."
"Sure, Dad. On the way."
Shaw hung up, then fished into his shirt pocket for his pack of smokes. Like everything else, Marlboros were in short supply these days, but he had been smart and stocked up before Gabriella. He had 3 unopened cartons underneath his cot. He went out the front door of the library, lit a smoke, and turned to the south to watch the oil rig fires burning along the horizon. They lit the sky a dusty shade of orange. In the heat of the day, the smell of the burning oil was so strong it made his eyes water. But at night it wasn't so bad. He inhaled deeply and let the smoke out through his nose, savoring the cigarette and the slight head rush that came with the first bullet after waking up. It was a good night. Cool, no clouds, and a mild breeze out of the west was carrying the smell of the dead bodies away from him. Thank God, he thought, for small favors. When he came back inside, his city-issued cell phone was ringing. He stood there, watching it, knowing exactly who was on the other end of the line. Shaw looked up. Eleanor Norton was watching him, a half-smile on her face. "Evan Robinson?" she asked.
"Yep, I'm afraid so."
He let out a groan. Trouble, he thought, is like a magnet. All it does is attract more trouble. He picked up the phone and hit talk.
"This is Shaw." "Captain, this is Evan Robinson. I've been trying to reach you since last night."
"Yes, sir."
"You don't return your phone calls?"
Shaw sighed.